So I was thinking about this. All of the people that I know who have ever been named Ruth have been completely strong and resilient people. Of course, there is the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The figure in cultural anthropology which comes to mind, a woman by the name of Ruth Benedict, who literally went into parts of the world where there were headhunters, and she studied them. And then, of course, probably the most powerful women's basketball athlete in ever is Ruthie Bolton, who played for Sacramento, came from Mississippi area, and she has bigger biceps than I have legs. And then, of course, those of a generation remember a certain Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Need I say more? But my favorite Ruth in my life was my grandma, Ruth Ellen Baird. Ruth was born in 1919, and this is Ruth in Merced, California, where she was raised riding, it must be said, her favorite pony. But my grandma was so strong, so resilient, so full of moxie and chutzpah. She raised 5 kids. She would get them into the bath and out of the bath and into bed and make meals for them. She taught them how to ride horses. She was married to a workaholic Presbyterian pastor. And honestly, I don't know, I've never met anybody like that before. She graduated from Cal Berkeley at a time when most women did not go to college, the first of a group. But the time in my grandma Ruth's life that I saw her being the most resilient was towards the end of her life. It happened on a Sunday afternoon at about 11 o'clock in Los Angeles, California. And there she and her late husband, James, my grandpa, were leaving the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church parking lot to go home to Pasadena. So all Grandpa had to do was get on the 5 to get to Pasadena. But Grandpa was beginning to lose it in his life. He was beginning to slow down, early signs of Alzheimer's, which would eventually claim his life 10 years later. So Grandpa gets on the 5, but going south. Grandma gently reminds him that he needs to go I-5 north, or the 5. And he says something like this, and he never lost his temper to anybody. But he said, "I am driving this car." And then he said something like, "Just be a passenger. Just be a passenger." And so that's what my grandma Ruth did. She was just a passenger, heading south through LA, through Riverside, and she was just a passenger. She decided to be a passenger as they continued through Palm Springs. She decided to be a passenger as they're heading towards Blythe on the border of Arizona and California. She said to herself, "I'm just gonna be a passenger." And it must be said that she decided to be a passenger for my grandpa for the next 10 years as he continued to devolve in his own motor skills and his own abilities. But that leads us to our first and main and most important point today. One of the keys to being a resilient person is, and would you say it with me, to just be a passenger. So what does that mean? It means that when you're a passenger, you may not understand what you're going through, but that you are just going to be a passenger and see where the road leads. It means that you may not like what's happening to you right now, but that you're just going to be a passenger and go along with it. It means that you may not know what the future holds, but that you're just going to, help me out, be a passenger and see what's around the next bend. In terms of a Christian perspective, being a passenger in this life means that you know and I know that we are not in charge of our lives, that God is, and that God knows what's best. Being a passenger means that life is full of mountaintop experiences, but it is also full of valleys, of shadows, of death. And being a passenger means that there are things and people and situations in life that intend to harm us, but that God is going to still use them for good. Now, one last point before we move to Ruth. Being a passenger does not mean that you have to be passive. Being passive says that you are going to let go and not really believe that there is a better future. And it must be said that there are times in our lives when there are abusive factors when we should absolutely not be passive. Being a passenger means that you have a destination and know that the future is going to be good. So let's take a look at Ruth from the Old Testament. Now, Ruth comes from a Moabite culture, and Moabite women and girls had absolutely no rights, absolutely no human dignity, or people treated them with any sense of decency. Even worse than the Jewish homes, the Moabite culture treated women very poorly, and that is how Ruth begins her life. The place that Ruth lived, Moab, was literally the geographic context of famine after famine after famine. So if you were a Moabite woman, the only place that you might advance in your life is by marrying as well as you can. And so that's what Ruth incredibly and miraculously does. She marries this socialite family from Jerusalem or from Bethlehem who have come down and have lived in Moab, and she marries a man named Mahlon, and they have a good life. But then he dies. And so she is totally lost, and yet if you were a Moabite woman, you could at least rely on your family or your married family to care for you. And that's where her father-in-law, Elimelech, dies. And her brother-in-law, Chilion, dies. And so there Ruth is, lost and alone. And that's where she decides to be a passenger.